Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our January 2024 Second Saturday Seminar. Happy New Year, and thank you so much for coming out on a Saturday morning. Today, we have Rob Sheppard with us, who is a board member of PennTESOL East and has worked on the conferences for PennTESOL East and has done quite a bit for us. And today he is going to share with us a lot of great information. So, Rob, the floor is yours.
All right. Isn't it funny how the smallest little things will make you nervous when there's like six people and you know two of them and you have to present and it's a little bit of build up like that. Can everybody see that? Yeah, cool. So good morning. Thanks for joining me again on a Saturday. I don't know what kind of person it takes to join a TESOL curriculum session on a Saturday morning, but it's probably my kind of people. And thanks for Bill for coordinating these. I don't know if everybody knows, but this is like Bill's baby. Bill makes all of these happen, and it's been a really great offering for this organization in the past year. So thanks, Bill. I will tell you a little bit about myself in a few minutes, but maybe everybody can drop into the chat like your name, your professional affiliation, and a couple of adjectives that you associate with curriculum. Name, organization, and adjectives for curriculum. So this is a session that I originally delivered at TESOL International in Portland last year. It is called The Map and the Shifting Terrain Components of ESL Curriculum. I was apparently in a very grandiose mood when I came up with this title and this like cartography theme. I definitely have some regrets about that theme now. You will see my commitment to this theme kind of decline as we go forward in the presentation. But a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about ESL curriculum. This is not a how-to. I'm not going to be talking about steps. I'm not going to be talking about curriculum as a process. I think we do a whole lot of that in like master's programs. There are lots of books about that. I literally want to talk about pieces of curriculum, components of curriculum, some ideas associated with curriculum, and how they fit together. So a big part of this session is basics, reviewing some terms and concepts. What is an objective? What is a goal? What is a scope and sequence? And then the other piece that I want to talk about is how all of those elements come together to form a whole. What does a curriculum look like when it's working? What does it look like when it's not working so well? So the idea is that there are some basics here for people who really haven't spent any time talking about curriculum, but I also hope that we will be like unsettling some assumptions for people who have more experience with curriculum. This session is not focused on a particular context. The concepts I'll be talking about refer to K-12 or adult ed or teacher training or whatever. But my own experience is in post-secondary ed, university IELPs, as well as adult education. So that's where most of my examples will come from. Just going to check that chat and see your adjectives. Bill Albertson, Drexel. Bill, you're supposed to give me some adjectives. How do you feel about curriculum? Val is adult ESL for Spanish-speaking teachers at Mi Casita. Nobody's giving me adjectives. How do we feel about curriculum?
Adjectives about how we feel about it. Okay.
Yeah, or whatever adjectives come to mind. For me, it's complex, it's shifting, it's challenging, it's fascinating, task-based.
Okay, so I'm a little boring. What can I tell you?
No, I like it. All right. This is a presentation. I have more than an hour's worth of material. I'm going to go long. You can cut me off. Please, I would prefer that if there's some back and forth, so please unmute yourself, raise your hand, drop questions into the chat. Bill, let me know if there are questions that I'm missing. So there is kind of like a thesis to this session. I'm making what I think is an argument, and the argument is that when we map our curriculum, we develop a stronger sense of the whole and the pieces, how they fit together. And in doing so, this allows us to make more intentional, more principled decisions about our curriculum. So we should map our curriculum. There are 4 parts here. I don't know why I have all this writing all over my slide here. The first part here is just big picture background of this session. The second part is defining some terms and concepts. And then we will move on to some real world examples and some questioning of assumptions that we may have about curriculum. So to start, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about my own biography, but I'm not referring to a whole lot of research here. So I just want to tell you that what I'm sharing is coming from my own experience, which is working at, for one thing, a university-based IELP. I'm at TCalc at Temple University right now. But I also have experience teaching in Boston, in Philly, in Taiwan and Korea. Now I work mostly as a program administrator. I work mostly with curriculum. Yeah, and in addition to university-based IELPs, I've worked at adult ESOL programs, so for immigrants and refugees at community centers. And this experience is relevant to this session because I've worked in different roles and I've noticed that in different settings, in different, can everybody see this like weird blue lines all over my screen?
Yes, and
I'm not doing that and I have no idea why that's there.
I'm trying to figure out if there's something I can do about it, but the eraser tool from my end is not doing anything.
So weird. Like I'm not using my cursor, so I don't know. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Oh, okay.
It's
Just gotta make
gone.
sure that doesn't happen again. Yeah, so in working in different roles and in different settings, something that really stood out to me is that people use curriculum terms very, very differently in different settings, in different roles, in different types of programs. What is an objective at one program is very, very different from what is an objective at another program. And I think this inhibits our ability to talk about what works in a curriculum and what doesn't work in a curriculum. And when I say, hey, I have this new idea of what I'm doing at my program, and I try to talk to somebody else at another program who uses the word objective differently, lots get lost in gets lost in translation. So that's why I want to focus a little bit on some of the terms and concepts. Does anybody know these books? Has anybody worked with any of these books? Maybe in your master's program, maybe in professional development sessions. Anybody have a favorite?
Mine would be anything by Jack C. Richards, but curriculum development was assigned in my grad program, so I guess I'll choose that.
Yeah, me too. So I love these books. These, in my opinion, are some of the best books on ESL curriculum that are out there. They're great. I have learned a ton from them. There are two big shortcomings of these books, in my opinion. The first is that I think they assume that we know the terms that they are using before we start reading the books. They will just start telling you about curriculum. At least one of these books does not define the word curriculum, despite being a basics of curriculum book. I don't think they give us a clear, concrete sense of what an objective is, what an outcome is, what the distinction between those terms is. So I don't think they spend enough time defining basics. And the second shortcoming of these two books is they don't have enough pictures. All of the best books have lots of good pictures, and I think pictures and diagrams are especially important when we are talking about something as massive and abstract and complex as curriculum. Visual aids are how we understand something complex like that, and these books have too few pictures and often very, very bad diagrams. So in this session, we're going to be focusing a lot on defining key terms, and we're going to be using lots of visuals to do so. Any questions about the overview so far? All right, moving on to section 2. So I'll be focusing on new terms in this section. I'm going to be sharing my understanding of these terms, not because my understanding is the right understanding or that you need to use the terms in the same way that I do, but I want to make explicit what I have in mind when I say objective. If you have a different sense of what an objective is, that's totally fine. I'm not trying to change your mind about that, but I think we need to be more explicit about this kind of thing and analyze how we are using these terms so that we can better communicate about curriculum. So take a second, think about what you mean when you say curriculum. If anybody wants to type their own definition of curriculum into the chat, I would love to see that. Oh, curriculum must be fun. It must be structured. Thanks. Ever evolving and living. I love that. Nisha hates them all. Anybody have a definition of curriculum that they'd like to share? You working on it? Curriculum for a course is a guided, but by a single goal, a list of objectives, which can be deliverables and discrete student learning outcomes. Risha says it's like composing Bohemian Rhapsody. I like that. Great. I'm going to share a couple of found definitions here. The first one is all of the learning which is planned and guided by the school. This is a definition from John Kerr from the 1960s. People who have studied curriculum will find some objections to this curriculum. I actually think it's a pretty good common sense definition of curriculum. I think it captures our everyday use of this word. Usually when I say the curriculum, I mean what the school wants me to teach. But there are limitations in scholarship that are worth recognizing. And one of the big ones is a lot of scholars would expand to say everything that goes into learning, whether or not it is planned. And the reason that this is a valuable distinction to make is if curriculum is only what the school guides in terms of learning, then every time the teacher departs from the plan, that's not curriculum. Every time the student learns something that was not intended, that's not curriculum by this definition. By the expanded definition, things that are learned without planning, things that are learned in spontaneous interactions are also a part of the curriculum. Does that make sense? Adding a little bit of specificity to that notion, there are different types of curriculum that some people have broken out. This is from Larry Cuban. He breaks things out into the official curriculum, which is distinct from the taught curriculum, which can be distinct from the learned curriculum and the tested curriculum, and also the supported curriculum, which is very relevant for anybody who is in an adult ESOL program. Often we have unfunded mandates. We have things that we need to do, but are not actually funded or supported to do. So that notion of the supported curriculum is valuable. There's a lot of talk these days about the hidden curriculum. Sometimes students are learning or observing certain social norms and social ideas about oppression and where they stand in the world that they naturally absorb through the experience of schooling. This can be the hidden curriculum of a school. This is not a direct quote, but I hear this in many of these textbooks and many articles about curriculum. Curriculum is a process and not a product. Do we agree? Have we heard this before?
I would argue that it is a product that dictates a process.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
My idea.
Dictates is an interesting verb there. Not supports. So I've heard this used in two different ways, actually. I think there are two different ways you can interpret this little quip. Some people use this to mean that curriculum is not documents, it's what you do with the documents. The curriculum is actually like how things come alive in the classroom. That's one way to understand this. I think another way to use it is to mean that we should focus less on where we're going to end up in a program and to focus more on like the journey of how to get there. I think there's wisdom in both of these meanings, but I've also heard this phrase used to diminish the importance of focusing on developing the actual documents. There are products that are associated with curriculum, and I would just push back against any attempt to use this phrase to diminish the importance of those documents. I do think there are products associated with curriculum that can be very useful, very valuable for teachers, and we should spend some time thinking about them. Before we move on to some other terms, I do want to share my own ideas about curriculum, my own terms that come to mind when I think of curriculum. I think about goals, objectives, outcomes, some of those terms that Bill used. I think about materials and content, needs, assessment. The word alignment is very important to me when it comes to curriculum. And I'm going to be talking about most of these. This list is not exhaustive, but this is what jumps to mind for me. So as we start to dig into some of the components of curriculum, I am going to be showing you several versions of this crazy colorful diagram rather. You can think, when I say a map of a curriculum, this is what I am picturing in my head. The idea here is to show the overall shape and structure of a curriculum. Like I said, I think that curriculum is so massive and so complex and shifting, ever evolving, somebody said, and abstract, that it's really, really difficult to step back and get a snapshot of the whole thing. And that's a major limitation in how we can teach people about curriculum. The fact that we can't just stop and say, hey, look, this is a curriculum. That's what I'm trying to do with this document, with this diagram, rather. This is something that I've used in working with curriculum for a while, but it's kind of new that I'm using it to share with other people. So if you have questions, if anything about this is not clear, please speak up. I won't be offended if this doesn't make perfect sense right away. Here's a version of it with labels. I just want to acknowledge that I am leaving out a huge amount of detail here, necessarily. In order to zoom out and step back, I'm leaving out what the day-to-day of lesson planning looks like. If you were to zoom in on the whole thing here, you would see Unit 1, Lesson 1, here's my objective, here's my content, here's my activities, materials assessment, and kind of like small cycles of that objective materials assessment, right? You're with me? Bill nod. Cool, thanks. Okay. Do you ever have words that like you use for years and years and years before actually thinking about what the word means that you're using? Do you know what I'm talking about? This is one of those words for me. I would just say scope and sequence, scope and sequence, scope and sequence, as though it were one word. I wouldn't think about what it actually meant. And then I realized one day, this is actually two words and it's very literal. We have a scope and we have a sequence when we talk about curriculum. And I think this is a valuable thing to think about for a second. Scope means the limitations of what we are including in a curriculum. We might have an English program. We might claim that we have a general English program. In reality, no program teaches all of English. We need to decide what we teach, what we don't teach. We have limited resources. We have limited time. What are we focusing on in this course, in this program? Some programs might be more focused on listening and speaking. Others might be more focused on writing and academic skills. We might include things beyond just English itself. If we're teaching study skills or something like that, we're making decisions about the scope of our program. What is within the scope of this program and what is outside the scope of the program? And this is often explicitly declared in your curriculum documents. This is a program that focuses on blah, blah, blah. And then we have a sequence. This is probably obvious, but when we teach, we need to decide what goes first, what goes second. We inevitably need to put things in chronological order of some kind. And there are different choices that you can make about what you decide to put in order in your program. A lot of programs, I think the most uncontroversial way to sequence a program is by thematic units. This unit, we're talking about classroom language. Next unit, we're going to be talking about places around the city and shopping and things like that. Next unit, we're going to be talking about food. We can sequence our curriculum in terms of thematic units. There are other ways to sequence a curriculum that are a little bit more controversial. You'll find that a lot of textbooks try to sequence grammar items, language points. This week, we're going to learn the present continuous. Next week, we're going to learn adverbs of frequency, and then we're going to do definite articles. This is called a synthetic syllabus, when you decide to do pieces of language in a prescribed order. And kind of the underlying assumption is that students learn what you teach and they learn it in the order that you teach it. I'm not going to change anybody's mind about this in 1 hour-long setting, but a whole lot of very smart people who do a whole lot of research about this say that this is not actually how language acquisition works, and we should think very critically about whether it's actually possible to say, this week you will acquire definite articles, next week you will acquire this verb tense, etc. See some points in the chat. Bill says it's important to remember that programs and courses have a scope and sequence. It's not just the name of that 2-page. Yeah. And actually, I'm going to point that out right now. The way that I visualize a scope and sequence, so this grid is how I conceptualize curriculum, and will continue to for this session. I think it's really helpful to organize from left to right chronologically. So here I'm just showing the different levels of a program, but you could zoom in and you have lessons and units, and from left to right is the passage of time. In a course book, they kind of try to treat your scope and sequence as the same thing as your table of contents. So they'll flip it and they'll have it vertical. But to me, this is much more intuitive and a good way to think about it. So when you're looking at this, the sequence is left to right. This is time passing. And the scope is the vertical dimension here. What things do we talk about in our program? What are the goals of our program? To develop spoken fluency, to develop students' reading and writing skills. These are the different goals in a program, and that determines what gets focused on within the curriculum of a program. That's the scope, is the vertical dimension there. Does this visual make intuitive sense to people? Do we have any questions about this before I start using it? Okay. So
I do have a question, actually.
yeah, go for it.
So when you say goal A, goal B, goal C, are you thinking of that as within a particular course, or goal A is the writing goal, goal B is the listening and speaking goal?
I think I will implicitly answer that in the next few slides. And if you still have that question in a few slides, I'll stop me.
Okay.
But I do have it crossing levels here. This is how I like to develop a curriculum. Not everyone does it this way. To me, a goal should cross courses, though. I'm going to do this in what might seem like an unintuitive order. I'm sorry about that. I think it's ultimately I decided this is the best order to approach these in. I want to talk about goals and outcomes first. These are two terms that I have found get used really, really differently in different contexts, especially in nonprofits versus university-based programs. I worked as a grant writer for a while at the same time that I was working in an ESL program. And I found that in grant writing and in nonprofit management, the notion of goals and outcomes is really clearly, really explicitly defined. And I want to borrow a little bit of that from my definitions here. So when we're talking about goals, I've got a couple of examples here. Students will develop their written English skills needed to navigate daily life in the US. Students will develop vocabulary used in daily life in the US. To me, goals talk about what you plan to accomplish at the highest level. For me, that's the course level. Goals are really helpful for describing a course to a teacher who might teach that course, or to a student who might take that course. If you want to just kind of talk about your program and say, hey, you could take this course or this course or this course, this is what you'll do in that course. That to me is a goal. What you will do at the course level by the end of that course. Note the will here. Goals are forward-looking. I think that's obvious. Some limitation of goals, though, is that they are too broad to guide our day-to-day teaching. I can't look at a goal for the course and say, that tells me what I'm going to do in class tomorrow. That's a limitation of a goal. Outcome, I don't think in settings I have worked in, the word outcome does not get used a whole lot in ESL, but that does vary a lot from context to context. And when it is used, I often see it as used almost synonymously with objective or goal. In nonprofit development, there's a more distinct, a more clear definition of it that I want to use here. Outcomes are comparable in size to goal, comparable in scope to goals. They're again at that big zoomed out course level. But unlike goals, outcomes are backward looking. They talk about what has actually been learned, what has actually been achieved. And to me, that's really valuable. Like we said, there's a difference between the planned curriculum, the taught curriculum, the learned curriculum. The value of outcomes is sometimes you achieve outcomes that were not in your goals. And if you're only looking at goals and not also looking at outcomes, you might miss some of the very important things that were achieved during the session, the semester, whatever, that were not in your goals. So it's valuable to have both goals and outcomes to make sure that you're capturing everything that happens in a program. Something else about outcomes, because they are backward looking, we can assess them, we can quantify them in very concrete terms like we've got here. 89% of our 137 students demonstrated significant improvement in the written, typo there, in the written English needed to navigate daily life in the US. These can also be really helpful for like funders. If you're in an ESL program and you need to tell your funders what you've done in the past year, show where their money went, outcomes are often what they want to see. We don't need to talk much about this, but in some programs, it's valuable to aggregate your outcomes into impact. so that like if you've got multiple different classes, you don't want to list out the 25 different outcomes that you had. You can talk in broad terms about the impact of your program. We had 150 students and 75% of them improved their English. Can be the really big picture impact statement. Okay, let's move on to objectives. Everybody know SWBAT? Students will be able to? I think objectives are the level of curriculum that most of us spend our time at when we're teaching. I got 4 different objectives here. Does anybody have, these are framed in very different ways. There are lots of different ways that you can write objectives. Do any of these strike someone as being the best way to write an objective? One of these to me is better than the others for reasons that I will share.
Well, I like A because it's really measurable.
Mm-hmm.
I can deal with B, I can deal with C, and perhaps this is me drinking some Kool-Aid for my graduate program, but my graduate program would have told me to reject D fully because you can't measure no. There's
Yeah.
no performance criteria.
I was taught exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna go with maybe the best one for me is probably A, because it talks about the function of the language to be able to speak about past experience, and then it talks about the form, that's focused on the present perfect. Even though it feels like there could maybe be a little more context included about the function, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, A and B are the best ones. I actually prefer B personally. For me, the thing that stands out about B is it doesn't prescribe the language that you need to master to do the thing. There are lots of accurate, valuable ways that if you asked a native speaker to talk about their professional experience, there's not a single right way to talk about your experience. And I like the flexibility that it gives you in achieving that function. But that does depend a lot on the philosophy of the program that you're at, that kind of thing. Manisha, anything you want to say about D?
I like D, primarily because it talks about form and function. So there is a lot of room there for teacher to improvise, to bring in her creativity.
Yeah.
I think looking at language, it gives a perspective about the language, which is great, not grammar, but form and function together. So if we could somehow combine B and D, that would be like I wouldn't say the best, but a clearer view of what should be going on in the classroom from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, I mean, D reflects the fact that even if we want students to get to B, like my goal as a teacher is to get students to B, but we need to teach students metalinguistic, or this depends on your perspective, but I think that you do need to develop some metalinguistic awareness for students of the grammar to get them there. I know that is not accepted by everyone, but yeah, I agree.
I think I could handle D if it had a different verb.
A different verb. What would your verb be?
I don't know. I was thinking about it, but I didn't come up with one. But no is not the one for me. Maybe write about professional experience.
Something observable.
Right. Using the correct form and function of present perfect or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So I think this part is going to be a review for almost everyone. The valuable distinction to me between objectives and goals is that an objective is specific enough that it can, in fact, guide your day-to-day instruction. You've got a goal that tells you where you need to be weeks from now. That goal breaks down to objectives that can tell you what you need to do this week that will keep you on track to meet your goal by the end of the semester, session, whatever. To me, the common sense way that I think of objectives is if one experienced teacher is sitting in a classroom watching another experienced teacher do what they do, you almost always have a sense of what that teacher is trying to do, right? Like I can see that you're trying to get students to use blah, blah, blah. That's your objective. That's your implicit objective is what I don't think you need to write it on the board for that to be clear to an experienced teacher. Whatever I can see that you're trying to get students to be able to do, that's your objective. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I am short on time. The point of these overarching horizontals is that there are things that shape curriculum that are outside of curriculum. Context and learners, of course, we need to build our curriculum to the needs of our learners, to the needs of our context. We need to conduct a learner needs analysis, maybe an environmental analysis. Again, not talking about that today, but everything that we do within a curriculum needs to be shaped to learner needs, context, things like that. In some cases, it needs to be shaped to the mission and the vision of the organization that you're in. And I think a valuable connection between those contextual factors that shape a curriculum and the curriculum itself can be a set of guiding values. So this is a set of guiding values that I developed at a nonprofit that was serving the immigrant community outside of Boston. We worked together with the teachers to say, okay, who are we as an organization? Who are our students? And what does that mean for our ESL program? How do we talk about our ESL program and our values in the broadest terms? Some of the things that we came up with are our program strives to maximize students' talking time and interaction with group work and pair work. Our program strives to ensure that classrooms are inclusive and welcoming to all. Our program strives to see that class content reflects our students' realities and goals. We went through this as like a team building activity at the beginning of a curriculum development process so that we could get on sort of common footing before we started writing goals and objectives and choosing materials. It was establishing common ground. Okay, alignment. Does anybody use the term alignment to talk about curriculum? Is this like an everyday word for you? Alignment is a funny one because if you look at the literature on alignment, you will find some people who say that alignment is the worst thing to happen to public education in the past 50 years. And you'll find other people who say that alignment is like a basic common sense feature of any functioning curriculum. I fall into the latter camp, but it's worth thinking about what is happening there because it illustrates something. If you dig a little bit, the people who say that alignment is the worst thing to ever happen to public education in the past 50 years are talking about something very different from just alignment in general terms. What they're talking about, well, so okay, first of all, my understanding of alignment is when we look at a horizontal here, from goals to objectives to content to assessment to the next set of goals, objectives, content, assessment, all the way over to outcomes and program impact, all of these things should make sense together. They should be in harmony. They should correspond to one another. Any person should be able to trace from left to right what you're intentionally doing in a program. To me, that is alignment in an uncontroversial sense, and we should do more work to make that happen. People who hate alignment are talking about something a little bit more specific and sinister. So this is internal alignment, when everything in a curriculum aligns with other things in a curriculum. But you can also have external alignment. Sometimes there's a set of standards we need to follow. Does anybody work in a program that uses the CEFR? We want to align our curriculum to the CEFR. This is external alignment. So we can have internal alignment and external alignment. Then there are other forms of external alignment where the government might come in and say, hey, guess what? We need more accountability. So we're going to give you a test, and everyone's curriculum needs to align to that test. And if students aren't passing that test, that means that there's something wrong with your curriculum. And what you then have is top-down mandated curriculum alignment to a test, forcing people to teach to a test. No Child Left Behind is the most famous example of this, and this is what most people are writing about when they're saying alignment is terrible and scary and ruining education. I would just point out that that is a very specific instance and problematic instance of alignment imposed by authority, not alignment generally. Does that make sense? So when I say alignment, I just mean goals should align with needs, which should align with objectives, which should align with instruction materials, etc. Bill says, I worked with a small group to completely overhaul our curriculum and align to the CEFR, and I think our curriculum is 1,000 times better for it. Yeah. Anything you want to say about that process or how it improved your curriculum?
It was long and arduous, but we found out that some of our goals and objectives from our old curriculum were not quite in the right order. And we also figured out that we probably had too few levels. And when we moved from 6 to 8 levels, we actually found that we had a much better success rate. And we didn't have people who started at the bottom getting to the middle and just failing because it was moving too fast. We're not seeing that to the same degree anymore. And I think it's been great.
That
And it also,
right there, that little like anecdote illustrates exactly like what is my main point here. If we step back and just take the time, it's not that there's a right way to do this, but having the chance to step back and look at the whole thing makes you realize things that are going on in your curriculum that weren't intended.
And it also helps to be able to, you know, when we have special programs coming in and such, and they want to know exactly what their people are going to be learning, and many countries are aligned to the CEFR already, it's very easy to say, here's the list of objectives and things that we do in this class to achieve this CEFR level. And I think it's actually brought us more business.
I'm not going to get into the marketing value of curriculum development, but appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. The last term I want to talk about here is strand. This word gets used very, very differently by different scholars. I think it's really valuable to think about strands as so when I say things are aligned horizontally, going from left to right here, that piece going across, and for me, this cuts across levels, is a strand. So for example, if we start teaching students skills-based reading, I'm not saying you should, but if that's the approach that you take in your program is skills-based reading, you start that in level 1 and you continue with it through your program, and you make sure that you're using the consistent approach, a consistent set of ideas that you're instilling in students from the beginning of the program to the end. That horizontal continuity is a strand. Okay. So I want to start talking about some specific case studies. I'm not going to show you the actual curriculum documents that we worked with. But again, I'm gonna take that sort of generic diagram of a curriculum, and now I want to talk about actual specific curriculum. Here, for each case, I am going to talk a little bit about the context and the learners. I'll talk about some of the terms that we've been using so far, and I'm going to present sort of the curricular predicament that we were in, the situation that we were in. And I'll hopefully try to show that mapping the curriculum helped us to make better decisions in that context. So the first case study is at a private language school. I don't know if anybody's worked at a private language school, but something like a university-based intensive program, but instead of being a unit of a university, it's like a small business. So this was a functioning private language school. They had a mix of international students and immigrants. They'd been around for years, but the situation that they were in is they were going up for accreditation, CEA accreditation, which meant that they were going to have to present all, yeah, it's a nightmare if you've ever been through it. This means that you need to take all of your curriculum documents and show them to someone who decides your future. It is a years-long process. It's really expensive and high stakes. And if you don't get it, it can mean that your business is going to close. So it was like, we need to get our shit in order, basically. So I was working as a curriculum consultant in this case. And my job, and I want to be clear here, my job was not to make a new curriculum. My job was to take what was already happening and find the underlying order of it and make it more aligned, make it more consistent. You can't start, like when accreditation is coming up, you can't start from scratch then. You need to get the existing pieces in order so that it's working better than it was before. So I say this to say that the final product of this curriculum was not what I would have designed from scratch. It was what I found as the underlying order of the curriculum that was already working. So in this program, their curricular documents consisted of a syllabus and a final test for each course at each level. And these were all on paper. So our process began by taking each of the syllabi, each of the final tests, and we took over a classroom and we laid them all out and we made this initial grid. There were 5 different courses in their program. Each of those courses occurred at 5 different levels. So the result was 25 different syllabi, 25 different final tests. And a couple of interesting things about this program. Each of those syllabi were just designed by the teacher who was teaching the course at the time. It wasn't like a group, we all sat down together and wrote a series of objectives. The teacher just kind of wrote down, this is what I do in beginner pronunciation. This is what I do in intermediate reading. There was never any coordination among levels. They also each selected their own book. So a student would move from pre-beginner to beginner to intermediate to advanced grammar and get 3 different textbook series that took very different approaches that were not designed to progress in a certain way. What intermediate meant to one teacher meant something different from what intermediate meant to another teacher, that kind of thing. As you can see, this is a pretty big program. What else about this? Something that really jumped out at us when we went through this process of mapping was that each of these courses accounted for the same amount of time in a week, for the same proportion of the program. So pronunciation is very, very important, but pronunciation was getting as much attention as grammar, which was getting as much attention as writing, which was getting as much, by the way, culture here is a speaking and listening course. So speaking and listening got the exact same amount of time each week as pronunciation. This was something that they didn't think about until step back and mapped their curriculum. So the very first thing we did after we laid out all of those documents on the tables was we started to build a map. We started to make their first scope and sequence, which they hadn't had before. We took, so each of the syllabi had goals, objectives. They use the term SLO. SLO is like a required term from CEA if you're doing the accreditation process, but that means objectives in this case. Yeah, we started making their first scope and sequence. And what became clear, what I'm trying to illustrate with this weird abstract art here, is that we realized that there were gaps in the curriculum because they had never sat down and said, this is what happens in my grammar class. This is what happens in your grammar class. There was never any check that like the full scope of grammar was addressed, that the pieces of grammar that are more important were getting the right proportion of time, obviously the present continuous, we use a whole lot more than we use the past perfect progressive, but you need to step back and look at your whole curriculum in order to make that decision. There were a lot of things that we realized here. Some teachers were approaching pronunciation in terms of articulation. They were talking about the sounds of the language. Other teachers were taking they were doing connected speech, super segmental stuff, and it would change dramatically from level to level. So there wasn't continuity. There were not horizontal strands across the program. So what we did was we started to see and reorder the existing objectives that were there, the existing goals that were there, and develop this out into something that felt a little bit more systematic, a little bit more guided. We weren't able to change the book thing in time for accreditation, but we did try to make a logical progression of their objectives, their outcomes. Because of the way the pronunciation worked, we started them with basic sounds, and then they would build out increasingly complex super segmental features and like discourse features of pronunciation. That's what's meant to be illustrated here. We tried to make sure when you're increasing the difficulty of like a reading passage, what does it mean for this reading passage to be more challenging than that reading passage? We tried to use consistent language to describe the development of reading over time, that kind of thing. So this is just a snapshot of what we did in that case. We assembled the syllabi into program-wide scope and sequence. We rephrased the goals to use more cohesive language across the program. And we organized the objectives into strands that aligned across programs, across courses rather. Any questions about that process that we went through? Okay. Let's talk about a second. I don't know if I'm going to get through the third one, but the second case study I'd like to talk about was a very, very different type of program. It was an adult ESOL program in a community-based nonprofit. It was serving adult immigrants and refugees, mostly from China, from Vietnam, Central America. Lots of these students had limited primary education. They had interrupted educations, and they were learning English 2 to 3 hours a week, primarily for survival. This was not to go to college. This was, I need to go to the store tomorrow. What do I do? So actually, I'm sorry, it was 2 to 3 hours at a time. It was 7.5 hours per week that the class met. In this case, you can see it is a much, much smaller program in scope and in progress. We had 5 different levels. Each level was 15 weeks long. Again, meeting for 7.5 hours a week. And this was not broken into separate courses. There was one integrated English course in which everything was addressed. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, there was no grammar course. There was no speaking course. It was one course per week. In this program, we had a textbook series that we liked well enough. It was a program, like many nonprofits, that really heavily relied on the textbook for the objectives of the curriculum. It was a pretty well-designed scope and sequence. We were pretty happy with it, but I did try to push back against how dependent we were on the book. And as I tried to push back, I realized that teachers and students would have revolted if we actually eliminated the textbook. So textbook was here to stay, whether I liked it or not. I think for students, it gave them a sense of security. They knew like what they were supposed to learn. And that was something that we had to take into consideration as we went through our curriculum process. So two of the limitations that we were dealing with in this program, that book was way, way, way too big for teachers to get through in a single level. There was like 50% extra material that students could not get through in a single level. And that was really, really frustrating for students. They felt like they weren't getting through everything that they wanted to do. And they felt like they weren't accomplishing what they were supposed to accomplish. They saw the book as the thing that they needed to do, and they weren't finishing it every session. So we wanted to push back against that. We wanted to get them to rethink what they were doing because there was more in this book than they needed to do. And the other challenge we were facing was standardized testing. This was in the state of Massachusetts. They were ramping up statewide testing for ESOL programs, and we had to use a test. If anybody's used the TABE Class E, has anybody used or heard of this? I hate this test with a passion. We had students who were doing so well in our program. We would watch how much they were learning and how much better they could express themselves, but they had to take this test at the beginning of the program. They had to take the test again at the end of the program, and they would show no progress on this test, or in some cases, they would see their score on this test go down over the course of the session. And it was so disheartening for teachers, for students. It was so demotivating. Yeah, so we were understandably frustrated, but we could not escape this test. So what we wanted to do, since we weren't getting rid of that test, we wanted to balance that test with our own authentic assessment that would more realistically show what students were accomplishing, what was actually happening in our program. This is actually a much, much more complex situation that I'm really simplifying for the sake of this presentation, but I'm focusing on two aspects of it. So to deal with that too much content thing, right? We were not getting through the book over the course of our 15 weeks. We decided to intentionally build a lot of flexibility and wiggle room into our scope and sequence. For each book had 9 units in it. We were getting through like 7 in a semester. So what we did was we surveyed our students and we said, which of these topics, which of these themes is most important for you? Turned out that they were very, very interested in the language of going to the grocery store, going to the hospital, going to the airport was surprisingly important, but we surveyed them to find out which were the most important topics, and we selected only 4 of them. Again, so there were 9 total in the book. We could get through about 7 in a semester. We only chose 4 to work on per semester, intentionally like underfilling the curriculum. And we would present this to students on a new document. When they come into the program, we would say, hey, this is what you're going to learn in this course. You're going to learn these 4 topics. And then we knew that they would get through those 4 topics. They would feel like they had accomplished what they were supposed to accomplish. And then they would have tons of extra time in that course to explore what they and the teacher decided was valuable for them. They could do another unit of the textbook. They could do another topic that interested them, something project-based, but we were intentionally building a lot more room into the curriculum so that students didn't feel rushed to get through the book and do the next page. Does that make sense? Yeah. For the second issue, we introduced something that we called can-do checklists. We were not using the word objective because objective implies that you need to do it by a certain time in the session. These were can-do checklists because we were just asking students to tell us what they can do. At the beginning of the session, students would get a sheet like this. They would check off the things that they could already do. They could maybe already do some of these things. I can make complex sentences. This is level 3. This was like a low intermediate. I can send and receive emails, things like that. We would ask students to check off things at the beginning of the session, and throughout the session, continue to check off new things that they had learned to do in our program. The most immediate effect of this was students were directly involved in tracking their own progress. This allowed students to track their own progress when they learned to do things in their own life that may be separate from our program. And they get like a very real, physical, tangible piece of evidence of their progress that had nothing to do with that stupid test that we still had to give them. Do you know what I mean? Another important piece of this, so those linguistic strands at the top, those came straight from the textbook. That's what we were already doing. That was our original set of objectives. But we also introduced these, what we call life-wide objectives, life-wide can-do statements, which were stuff that you can do in life. I learned to take the bus by myself. I learned to ask for a refund at the grocery store. And there's no single right way to do this. There's no language form that you need to use. It's just, can you do it? Can you not do it? This connected a lot more with what students wanted to do in their life. It also, this was a nonprofit where we were seeking funding, and we needed to talk to the city and people from a foundation about our program. This allowed us to talk in very like common sense terms about what students get out of an ESOL program. If you try to tell your funder that like your students can now pronounce unvoiced dental fricatives or use the present perfect continuous, they have no idea what the value of your program is. But if you tell people that your students can now take the bus by themselves, they really understand the impact of a program like this. We aggregated these can-do statements into outcome statements that we would then publish in like our annual report, that kind of thing. These were outward facing. So after we were done expanding our curriculum, it looked like this. We have these language strands that were the basis of our original ESOL program, and they were focused on language stuff that you can do. But then we said, what can a student do with digital media? What can our student do at the bank? My student can go open up a bank account now. We treated those as objectives and outcomes of our program. We had expanded the scope of our program in this way. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is just a snapshot of what we did. Just reiterates what we just talked about. All right, if I've got, Bill, should I be stopping because it's 11? What should we?
I have nothing else to do, so I'm very happy to stay here, continue. This will be recorded.
Mhm.
I think people do need to leave. They are welcome to do so. They were welcome to do so the whole time. It's Saturday. But I think that we can continue this and, have the recording. I'm here.
I have one more case study, and this case study is the one where it's like, there are some things we could question about those previous examples. And I think, and this will actually be very familiar to Lynn, who has taught the course that I'm talking about here. The idea with this last case study is I wanted to try something very new that didn't have some of the same assumptions that we often have when we design a new curriculum. I'm going to show some statements on the screen. Some of them will be controversial to some people. They are things that I deeply believe about language teaching, but I do understand that they may come off as, controversial to begin with. The first was teaching does not cause learning. What I mean by that is that learning, especially in language, emerges from something other than our teaching. There is not a one-to-one correspondence between the things that we teach and the things that we learn. Sometimes we teach things and students don't learn them. Sometimes students learn things that we don't teach. So teaching is not the source of learning. Learning is a thing that can happen in the context of teaching, but teaching is not like the cause of learning. That's what I mean there. Language development emerges from interaction and negotiation. This is the interaction hypothesis. The idea here is that getting students to basically struggle with the language, struggle against the limitations of their current language, is where language development happens. That's what I mean by that second one. Oh, this is not parallel form. That's terrible. Maximize student talking time. We should maximize student talking time, is the basic principle there. I think that's intuitive. And different students are ready to learn different things at a different time. What I mean here is that connects to that idea of, can we sequence what students will learn? My answer to that is no, we cannot. We cannot say that tomorrow you are going to acquire the present perfect, because each student in your class is at a different place because they came from a different starting place, right? Because they've been focused on different parts of the language in your program. So different students are at different places, ready to learn different things. And to me, that has huge consequences for how we design a language curriculum. Is that clear? Why? Anybody want to tell me I'm very wrong here before I move on to the curriculum? Manisha, later on that? Fair enough. Okay, so these were some just ideas that were in my mind as we approached the next situation. This is the one that I will tell you was at TCOC. The other two examples were at past programs that I feel free to speak openly about. This is at TCOC. This is where I work right now. And we were in the middle of the worst of COVID. We were forced online. Our program is an academic English program, and our director said, we're not offering general conversation. That's not a thing that we do here. There are plenty of places for general conversation, but we wanted to offer something. We kept having people who wanted to sign up for our program online 2 or 3 hours a week. They don't want to commit to a full-time program online. We had students who they didn't have time to commit to homework. They didn't have 15 hours a week to commit to a program like ours, but they wanted to develop their academic English. We just kept getting inquiries like this. The pandemic was like shifting the dynamics of the market or whatever. So this was like a design challenge. What can we do to offer something that is academic English, that doesn't have a whole lot of homework, that doesn't require materials or lots of reading? Because think about the fact that when we're developing academic English, usually what that means is we're very focused on reading and writing, right? That's a huge part of what makes academic English academic. We were trying to figure out, how can we develop academic English in a few hours per week without a ton of reading and writing, basically. So what we came up with, Lynn, this is PACE. I'm not talking about it here, but we call this course Professional and Academic Conversations in English. And the idea was that this was not a course focused on teaching. It was a course focused on creating a certain type of interaction among students and sustaining that type of interaction among students where they're right at the edge of their proficiency, when they're really struggling to do things that they want to do with the language, which is difficult to do when you have advanced students. These are like C1 students in some cases. So what we did, instead of sequencing what students will be able to do, instead of sequencing what we will teach, we sequenced types of interaction. We said, what are some types of interaction, some types of language use that happen in an academic setting, and how can we maintain those in speaking, only in speaking and interaction? So we came up with 4 different phases. We said, students in an academic setting need to be able to have discussions about abstract, complex topics. They need to share their own beliefs and why they believe those things. That's basically just advanced conversation, right? That's the usual advanced conversation. Students need to be able to talk about abstract, complex things. The second thing that they often need to be able to do is talk about texts. You've read something, you need to be able to talk about text, and you use different language when you talk about texts. You use different language when you're talking about somebody else's ideas that you may or may not agree with and that you want to express that agreement with or not. You need to engage with the claims that other people have made, and that elicits a very different type of language, right? Third thing that students need to be able to do is talk about data, talk about graphics, talk about charts, engage with, especially these days, engage with infographics, that kind of thing. That's a third thing that students need to be able to do in an academic setting. And finally, they need to be able to work together. They need that interpersonal, like we're working together on a project, and this involves a whole lot of negotiation toward a shared goal that is, there's no right way to do this. There's no single correct way to do this, but we need to figure out how to do this together. We decided that those 4 functions would shape our curriculum. So each lesson in this program went through what we call 4 phases. In a 2-hour lesson, we tried to say a half hour would be on academic discussion, a half hour would be on engaging with like an excerpt of text, talking about what is written in that text. It wasn't like a long reading. It was like a paragraph we can put on the screen. And let's talk about what this person claims. Let's talk about whether we agree with it or not. Let's analyze why they believe what they believe. The third phase was data, discussing data. We would show an infographic on the screen, and we would talk about what this means. We would analyze a very complex infographic. I should have this on screen. I didn't expect to get this far into this. And the last thing we would do was a fully task-based learning session. It would be, as a group, come up with a white paper proposal to give to the dean of your school, for example. They'd work together for a half hour, 45 minutes to develop a white paper to propose to make the campus more energy efficient, that kind of thing. So implementing the principles we've been talking about, what we were sequencing here was student interactions on the assumption that language emerges from the interactions. Rather than sequencing teaching, rather than sequencing outcomes or objectives, we were sequencing interaction types. And to me, that is something we should consider when we're thinking about alternative ways to build a language curriculum. Ooh, can you say more, Manisha?
Yeah, small reading, but more work. So just take information from both text and charts and just statistics, plain statistics without any explanation. So they write the explanation or the summary of the data and then incorporate that with the textual information to create something new or present it somewhere. So just a mock situation where they could be in a university situation. That's all. So something along the same lines. Love it.
I'm going to stop there. I could go on, but I am over my time, and I think you get the gist. So
Does anyone have
thanks.
any questions or comments?
Lynn, if you want to speak freely about the actual realities of teaching pace and what works and what doesn't.
I didn't hear Bill's question. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. What did you say, Bill?
Does anyone have any questions? Is what I said.
Yeah, so I'm thinking a lot about pace right now because I'm teaching it for the first time in person. So this is going to be very interesting. I piloted it a couple of times in my classroom over the last couple of sessions, just choosing one of the topics that sort of fit into our other curriculum. And we did like a mini version, and students were really excited about it. They like the idea of just talking with their peers and being in groups and having the freedom that this affords, as opposed to the structure of the textbooks that they're used to using for their speaking activities. Also love the idea that there's no homework, which drives me a little crazy, but I think it's a really valuable way to, I don't want to say scaffold, because they don't necessarily build on each other. Each interaction doesn't necessarily build, but it does build confidence and allows students to interact with different members of the classroom, which is often hard to do in a regular listening and speaking class. Built into the way that I do it is switching groups so that they're always talking to somebody different, which is stressful in the beginning, but really valuable in the end. Basically my thoughts on it now. We'll check back in 7 weeks.
I should say we started this one, and it was just coincidentally, but like this seemed possible because we were talking about such an advanced level. It's a lot easier to conceptualize this working at a really advanced level where students are already like pretty autonomous with the language. They can already do so many things with the language. We just, for the first time, piloted a basic version of this, like with our lowest level students. was rough. It was rough. The development of it was rough. It took a really, really long time, but we just finished our first semester of it and it worked. It was a whole lot of work on the teacher to begin with, and the development, and Lynn played a role in developing that. It was tough, but it is working. Like to me, the most important takeaway is these students are doing it. I subbed for it a few weeks ago, and it was so much fun, and they had so much fun, and they were using the language that they had in really fascinating ways. If anybody's ever done what do you call it? Teaching Unplugged, dogma teaching. It's a version of that, and it worked. It was just so much fun to do. Anyway. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Bill.
I was just saying, any other questions or comments? Well, Rob, I'd like to say thank you so much for this. I think you gave us a lot of things to think about. As Val said too, you gave us some validating things too, that, you know, perhaps some of us could see your chart and see our curriculum in that chart, but maybe we hadn't conceptualized it, you know, as that before. And I think that was really valuable. So thank you so much, Rob. And thank you for everyone for coming. I hope that some of you come back next month in February. It's whatever the second Saturday in February is. I'll be the presenter. So if you're interested in learning more about using ChatGPT as a tool for teaching grammar, I'll be here doing that. So we'll see you all then. Bye.